Imagine a single year so dark that people believed the world was ending, not a war, not a single empire collapsing, but moments in history when everything went wrong at once: volcanoes that erased cities, diseases that killed millions, empires that fell into chaos overnight. History remembers centuries as ages of progress, but each century has one year that stands out as pure disaster. Tonight, we are not telling the story of heroes. We are counting the worst years humanity ever lived, century by century, and once you hear what happened, you may realize how fragile civilization truly is. We are now in the 21st century. That means humans have been counting centuries for more than 2,000 years. Everyone knows that the basis for calculating these centuries is the birth of Jesus Christ. Even though it is not 100% accurate, it is still the origin of this historical system. Other calendars also exist, such as the solar calendar and the lunar calendar. But this is the calendar that Western societies established, and the one that has been accepted globally, meaning world history is calculated based on this system. Anyway, these 21 centuries that have passed so far have seen many good years, and many bad ones. Alright, let's start with the first century, the year 79 AD. This is when Mount Vesuvius in southern Italy begins to become active. This volcano is known as Vesuvius. It doesn't take long before it erupts. Molten material begins pouring down toward two cities below it, Herculaneum, and the more famous one, Pompeii. Today, geologists have calculated that when Vesuvius erupted, it erupted violently, so violently that every second 1.5 million tons of molten material were being thrown into the air. They have calculated that the energy of this eruption was 100,000 times stronger than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The molten material quickly covers the city of Pompeii, so fast that people, buildings, and everything inside the city are trapped beneath the debris, and exactly where they stand, they are burned to charcoal. Some scientists believe these people were fossilized, men and women, children both young and old, and animals, all burned beneath this fire, and turned into stone. Something like this has never been seen anywhere else. Because of these stone bodies and burned remains, Pompeii has become a tourist destination that people can still visit today. Just imagine, you are living in a city in those days, and suddenly you see molten rain falling from the sky onto your head. That is why the year 79 AD is known as the worst year of the first century. It should be mentioned that all the years we describe are based on documented evidence. You might say, well, maybe more people died that year in Japan, but it was not recorded. Let's move on to the second century. The worst year of this century appears to be the year 165 AD. This is when a strange disease known as the Antonine Plague reaches ancient Rome. The Romans themselves claim that this disease came from the Parthians. They say soldiers who fought against the Parthians brought it back to Rome. There is no solid evidence for this, but that is what they claim. Some historians say this claim is baseless, that if the plague had truly come from the Parthians, there should have been a massive death toll there as well. But no such catastrophe is recorded in history, not even in Roman records themselves. In any case, this plague killed 10 million people. That is an enormous number. At that time, 10 million might have been 10% of the world's population. What's interesting is that modern scientists have discovered that this disease was actually a form of smallpox, and this was the first global outbreak of smallpox. After that, it kept returning, killing again and again. Even just 100 years ago, smallpox was still killing people. The outbreak of smallpox in Rome caused relationships between civilizations to break down. The economy was severely damaged. It is recorded in Parthian history that Rome's economy collapsed because of the plague. Trade routes between east and west were shut down, and the Parthian economy also suffered greatly, because this was the Silk Road. Alright, let's move on to the 3rd century, the year 251 AD. This was a strange and devastating crisis, known as the crisis of the 3rd century. The disaster begins in 235 AD, but reaches its peak in 251. In 235, Emperor Alexander Severus is assassinated, and suddenly, the Roman Empire collapses into chaos. Every region does its own thing. Romans begin fighting Romans, violently, something like the Chinese civil wars, where everyone is killing each other. At the same time, Rome descends into anarchy. The newly rising Sassanid stake power from the Parthians. They are not yet fully stable, so instability spreads from Rome into Iran. A small internal conflict also forms within the Sassanids, but not as severe as Rome, because people there were not fighting each other directly. Even so, this internal conflict severely weakens the Sassanid economy. Its effects reach as far as China and India. Because the Silk Road is essentially the artery of the world economy, when even one civilization along this route becomes unstable, it affects all of them. There is a full video about the Silk Road already available if you'd like to watch it. Ancient empires, despite constantly fighting each other, always made sure none of them collapsed completely, because if one section of the road closed, instability would spread to the next empire. Now let's see the worst year of the 4th century. This century has more than one. The first is the year 365 AD. A massive earthquake strikes the island of Crete in modern-day Greece. Geologists estimate this earthquake measured 8.5 on the Richter scale. Crete itself suffers limited damage, but the earthquake generates a massive tsunami heading toward North Africa, and its main target, Alexandria. In Egypt, this wall of water crashes into Alexandria. Historical records say the city is washed away, and then dragged back into the Mediterranean Sea. That is why it is estimated that tens of thousands of people died. This tsunami also reaches Cyprus and Phoenicia, but those regions were not as densely populated and suffered fewer deaths. Another major year in the 4th century is 391 AD. In China. In this year, the Jin dynasty suffers multiple military defeats. This causes all of China to become unstable, everything collapses, and a massive civil war begins. Chinese civil wars are infamous. The deadliest wars in history have occurred in China, fought between Chinese people themselves. If you look at Chinese history, you'll see that despite repeated collapses and brutal internal wars, eventually, someone rises, unites everyone again, and China becomes whole once more. On a map, China almost never remains fragmented long-term, much like the Iranian plateau, which has broken apart many times, but always reunified into a single nation. The 4th century was full of bloodshed. So let's move on to the 5th century. Hopefully the worst year here is not another massacre. The year is 410 AD. In this year, Germanic tribes, especially the Visigoths, successfully sack Rome. This is the first time since the founding of the Roman Empire that a foreign force manages to loot the city, and these were the people the Romans called barbarians. At this point, Rome is already divided: the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, and the Western Roman Empire, whose capital has now been sacked. From this point on, the Western Roman Empire never regains its former glory. Slowly, it collapses, and those same barbarians take power, forming what becomes known as the Holy Roman Empire, or as the Nazis later called it, the First Reich. With the fall of Western Rome, Europe collapses with it. Yes, the Holy Roman Empire exists, and Byzantium controls parts of the Balkans. But Western Europe enters 100 years of darkness, known as the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages. It should also be mentioned that in this same 5th century, in 451 AD, Attila the Hun marches from Central Asia, north of the Caspian Sea, into Europe, further devastating Western Europe. By this point, Western Europe has lost any remaining dignity. Let's move on to the 6th century, the worst year, 536 AD. Western historians consider this year so terrible that they call it worst year in history. It is as if the earth itself is trying to explode. From every direction, according to archaeologists, multiple volcanoes erupt across the world within a short period of time. Major eruptions occur in Papua New Guinea, Ecuador, and Iceland. First, they release massive amounts of ash. So much ash that clouds form in the sky blocking out the sun. A volcanic winter begins. For 2 years, sunlight does not reach the earth, crops fail everywhere. Across the world, huge numbers of people die from starvation, from the westernmost parts of Europe to the easternmost regions of Asia. The civilized world is starving and dying. If you want to learn more about this, search for the volcanic winter of 536 AD. Let's move on to the 7th century. In the 32nd year of this century, 632 AD, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the Prophet of Islam, dies, without appointing a successor. This creates a power vacuum, division, even multiple divisions, and for years Muslims kill each other over it. 19 years later, in the 51st year of this century, the Sassanid Empire of Iran collapses. Muslims conquer not only the Sassanids, but also half of the Byzantine Empire. Now the 8th century. In 750 AD, Abu Muslim of Khorasan overthrows the Umayyad Empire, replacing it with the Abbasids. This transition triggers numerous wars, and many people die before stability is restored. Now the 9th century. In the 5th year of this century, 865 AD, Vikings land on the coasts of England, and take full control of the island. The English are defeated so completely that for 14 years, the Vikings engage in killing, looting, slavery, rape, and many other atrocities. Now the 10th century. In 907 AD, the Tang dynasty in China collapses violently. China splits into 5 regions, each ruled by a warlord. 5 warlords, trying to destroy each other. Another deadly civil war begins, for 53 years, until 960 AD. They kill each other relentlessly. There are no exact statistics, but it is estimated that millions of people were slaughtered. We have now seen the worst years of 10 centuries. We have no choice but to split this video into 2 parts, the first 10 centuries, and here, the next 10 centuries will be covered in part 2, airing the day after tomorrow, at the same time. But if we step back for a moment and look at all these centuries together, a repeating pattern emerges. The worst years in history were usually not caused by a single event, not just one volcano, not just one disease, not just one war. They were moments when multiple crises collided at the same time. Nature turned hostile, powers collapsed, and humanity, for a while, lost control of its own fate. History shows us that civilizations do not break from a single blow, but from slow erosion, and at the same time, that very history proves that humanity has almost always stood back up again. So when we talk about the worst years, we are really talking about the fragility of the world and the resilience of humanity at the same time. This is not just a story of death and destruction. The real story is that despite everything, history continued, and the next century was always born from the ashes.